Little late to the party on this one, but hi, this is CableNA for GlumboCorp Reviews. I'm just talking about some of my favorite and least favorite movies of 2023. It was a pretty great year for movies overall. I think there were a lot of good movies, but also there were a lot of bad movies. And I saw a lot during the year, so I wanted to share my thoughts on what some of my favorites were, what some of my least favorites were, some honorable mentions here and there, and hopefully you'll be able to find a new recommendation for you to check out, whether that's a good movie that you'll be able to fall in love with, or a bad movie that you can riff on and watch with friends, or at least know to avoid. I'm going to have this more casual, not super well scripted talking. I'm going to have more genuine honesty with how I'm talking about it just in the moment. I think it creates a more genuine response when I'm talking about something, because I do enjoy talking about movies like this, and it's not going to be as super professional, but I kind of like it that way. Also, because it's always a little strange, I just wanted to throw out the disclaimer that there's a couple of movies that you might be expecting to see on here but are missing, mainly the main trio of American Fiction, The Zone of Interest, and All of Us Strangers. Those movies weren't available to me, and they were only available when they hit sort of wider releases in 2024, so I would count them as a 2024 release in my sake, not a 2023 release. And in the same vein, there's a couple movies that I am qualifying for this list that wouldn't be on a lot of other people's lists. Movies that you'll see, there's one on my bottoms list, worst of the year, that you'll see in the bottom three, but also I would qualify Women Talking for this. It didn't make my top 20, but it is a slight honorable mention that would qualify because I was only able to see it in January at the beginning of this year, even though a lot of people sort of considered it in 2022 because that was when it did its shorter announces and limited releases in New York and California, as well as their times at film festivals. But I'm going based off of how I was able to see movies because that makes the most sense to me, and it also makes me connect more with average audiences as well, I think, because I am just an average audience. I don't have the critics special treatment just yet. Here's just some honorable mentions for other great movies from this year that just couldn't make the top 20. I wanted to bring up Infinity Pool, which is a great horror movie by Brandon Cronenberg that was very wild and had a lot of crazy visuals and concepts. Outlaw Johnny Black was a new sort of satirical black comedy from the makers of Black Dynamite, except it had a Western spin on it. I thought maybe not as good as Black Dynamite, but I had a lot of fun with it. Air, sports biopic with Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, a lot of fun. I think still a bit commercial, but honestly, Ben Affleck's a great director and he made it work, and it works pretty well in the moment. Guardians 3, easily one of the best superhero movies of this year. I thought it was really well done. James Gunn knows how to direct that type of movie. Tetris, also another biopic. I think that was silly, a little too over the top, non-realistic, but it's hard not to have fun and get wrapped up in it. Taron Egerton does a great job. I liked the other shorts by Wes Anderson during the Henry Sugar. That one was in the main list, but I like Poison especially. That was a great shorter. Hard to really include it because it is a short, but it was also great. Megan Mithrigan, great little horror film from the beginning of the year. Had a lot of fun with it. It knows just how absurd it is, and it leans into it. Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Definitely a great adaptation to that classic Judy Blume book, and I feel like it works really well for the big screen. A great supporting performance from Rachel McAdams. Wonka surprised me pretty well because it didn't really latch on to just being a reference fest with, oh, remember things from Willy Wonka, and it was its own musical thing, which hard to be that disappointed in the same director, Paul King, who did Paddington movies. David Fincher's The Killer on Netflix was really fun, and I think had a lot of great moments. It was weirdly comical with how it was reflective on Fincher's past career. And The Iron Claw, which was really emotional and had a lot of great moments. One of the best performances from Zac Efron. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. This movie was really good. I think it had a lot to live up to compared to the first Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and I didn't like it as much as that one, but frankly, that was kind of a groundbreaking animated movie, and not a lot of movies can live up to that one. So it's fine that this one's not as good. I still really liked Across the Spider-Verse for what it did and added to it. I think it still looks really good. That's the absolute highlight of this movie. Same as the last one, is the visuals. It looks amazing. There's something always in the background that you can notice every time. It's a movie that you can watch 100 times and you can notice something on each repeat viewing. It's really good. arguably this one might even be more beautiful than the last one. I think there are some still issues still, and I'll get to that, but there's so much good about Across the Spider-Verse that's still worth watching, and it lives up to the original as a successor. I think in general, it feels just like a love letter to comics in general. Not even just Spider-Man, but it feels like every like frame of this movie and every like second you feel there's just a love for comics as a medium from the people making it. And it shines through and it makes the whole experience that much better because you know they care about comics and they care about doing these characters right. It works so well because of that. The music, it's really good. It works super well. Each of the scenes, I think the characters have evolved enough from the last movie to it feels like a more mature, like the first movie was like setting the ground rules and like still establishing these characters. This feels like a perfect mature evolution of these characters, and it feels like the stakes are increased a lot. The Spot, great new villain. He's a lot of fun to watch. I wish there was more of him, but he's a great villain. And I think Jason Schwartzman does a great job voicing him. I think the movie's also very funny. There's a lot of comedy. And I mean, like, the last movie had comedy, but this one still has a lot of comedy. There's a lot of moments that work. I think it's a little, like, very, I don't want to say Reddit, but, like, very nerd-focused, where it's, like, you got to be a little in on some of the jokes, but I still feel like there's enough there that even someone who doesn't know a lot about comics and Spider-Man and all the different past can still find and enjoy it. I think the big issue stopping this from being higher on my list is it's on the top of a lot of other people's lists, but the one thing stopping me is the complaint a lot of people have had is the pacing issues, because it does not really feel like it has a standard 3-act structure. It feels like you took a standard rising action call adventure. It feels like you took a normal movie and sliced it right down the middle, and it doesn't, and the pacing feels really off because of that. And I think that's like the only thing really stopping this from being an amazing, better than the last one movie. That, and there's no Spider-Ham. You need more Spider-Ham. But still, this was a great watch, and probably most people have already seen it already, but it's really good. Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. I watched all the Mission Impossible movies leading up to this one. I kind of fell in love with the series because I think they do action really well. I think it's kind of exciting to watch it. As much as Tom Cruise himself is kind of a jackass and has some sketchy things to his past with this Scientology stuff, it's hard to deny just how emphatic and exciting it is to watch these movies, and this one feels like it raises the stakes to like really high levels. I think the increased runtime does a lot. It really does well with its pacing. It feels like the action is constant. There's so many iconic moments and great things. I think it's not as strong as some of the last ones. It's not as good as the last one, Fallout, but it still holds up, and I think it does a great job. I think the villains, especially, a lot of the characters, they're great. Pom Clementif as like the main, that I mispronounced that, but she does a great job as like the main sort of goon. She's silent. She like steals the screen every time she's on screen. I think Isai Morales is the main villain, even if they try to hone in this like, oh, he's been connected to Ethan this whole time, which isn't that great, but I think he kind of makes it work because he works so well. I think the AI plot is kind of funny, but it works pretty well, and it's kind of really timely because this movie came out like right when AI was booming. Honestly, this really was a fun time, and I really enjoyed the action. It was really great. I think Tom Cruise knows how to make action work well, and Mr. Christopher McQuarrie, also as a director, knows how to make it work really well. And I think it does really stand out. It's a lot of fun. The whole last third is so good. It raises the stakes so well when they're on the train, and the piano when it falls. There's so many good things in this movie to like recognize, and it makes me more excited for how they're going to finish the series with the, not even Dead Reckoning Part 2 because they changed the name, but I'm excited for what they're going to do next. I kind of love this series now. It's so much fun. I feel like, especially when so many action movies that come out nowadays are very hit or miss, depending on like, oh, like the action can feel cheap and it can be so easily done with effects. It stands out so much that it feels like every scene in this movie is hitting you with something, and it's getting you excited, and you don't know what's going to happen next. And it feels like there's so many different scenes. Like there's the stuff in the airport, and they're sneaking around, and there's stuff on the train at the end, and there's some stuff in the desert, and there's like the fights on the bridge, and there's a thing where Ethan Hunt is running. There's the car, the yellow car. There's so much good shit in this movie. It's totally worth watching. Even if you haven't seen any of the other ones, I think this is worth watching on its own. You can immediately get it and understand the excitement behind it. There's so much good inherent like action and comedy. It blends so well, and I'm very excited. This is definitely one that went under the radar because it came out the week before Barbenheimer, and it got kind of fucked up because of that, but it's definitely worth going back and watching. I think this did a really great job in terms of an action blockbuster this year. Godzilla Minus One. I think it's immediately hard to not compare this to the other Godzilla movies that have come out recently, from Legendary, Godzilla King of the Monsters, the Godzilla with Bryan Cranston, Godzilla vs. Kong. And those movies, I always felt, weren't that great. It feels like they didn't do Godzilla sort of justice. They just think like, oh, he's just a big monster guy and we can just have him do things. But they really lack in terms of actual character writing, and they only really exist so that you can look up the scenes with the monsters on YouTube later. There's no real reason that anyone would want to rewatch those movies. There's not really anything interesting. And also, the lighting is just bad. But this isn't about those. This is about Godzilla Minus One. And I think Godzilla Minus One is amazing, and it feels like the first, like, really next level Godzilla movie in a long time. Granted, I haven't seen Shin Godzilla, which I hear a lot of good things about, but Godzilla Minus One really understands the gravitas and weight of the original and uses that and really just modernizes it in a way that works so well. Because other modern Godzilla movies kind of miss the point. They just think, oh, he's a big monster. But this one, it understands like the weight of Godzilla as a character, and it uses that to propel these like really powerful themes of post-war Japan that I think work really well, and just the resilience now they get beaten down. And it works so well. And it works so well because these human characters are so good, and you feel for these characters. And it deals with a lot of heavy topics like kamikaze pilots and like post-war guilt. And it works so well. It doesn't seem like it would, but when you actually like focus on telling a human story first and then a Godzilla story second, I think that works so much better than how they do it here in America. The other thing works so well. Godzilla's like actually a threat in this movie. He's terrifying. He shows up on screen and you like feel like shivers in the back of your spine. He is a nightmare creature. And treating this movie like a horror monster movie and treating it like, oh, you want to care for the actual human characters, you want to see them get out of here, and treating Godzilla as this ever-increasing, just nightmarish threat. When he uses the atomic breath, the big thing is not, oh, look, it's the breath, it's cool, he did the shit, the big laser. The big thing is you see the human standing in the destruction with a whole bunch of like nuke iconography, and it's so just heart-wrenching. It hurt, but it's so well done. I cannot believe that Godzilla movies have been made so many years and they aren't trying to be so melodrama and just powerful like this. It feels like, what have we been doing for all these years if not making a Godzilla movie like this? Also, it looks great. There's been like discussion about budget and like crunch and all that, but I think it looks really well made. I think the effects on Godzilla look great. I think just in general, the production design, like the town, the city looks great. There's a lot to like about Godzilla Minus One, even if you might be hesitant because of the language barrier, because it's in Japanese. Definitely worth watching, even if you don't watch these types of movies. Genuinely worth a watch. It's that well made. Priscilla. It's hard to immediately not think of Elvis 2022 because we just had a big Elvis biopic, and this is completely different in tone and how it approaches the story. But that Elvis biopic felt very just in your face. It was so much about Elvis, the mythos, just what Elvis is as an icon. You think the flashy lights, you think Vegas, you think the home, baby, you think all that stuff, and it's hard to not get wrapped up in that and the excitement. I think that works well. But I like this more because it takes a more grounded, it takes the more realistic approach. It instead goes towards Elvis the man, like the real truth behind it. And how much of this at its truth? I think there's a fair bit, because this did have a lot of connection with the real Priscilla Presley. We were able to tell her story. And I think it's much more interesting seeing this as a companion piece to the other movie, because this is a lot darker, it's a lot more disturbing. It makes you very uncomfortable because it goes into the real sort of truths about Elvis dating this 14-year-old girl while he's 24. And it's, it's weird, but it does talk about like the actual love that's there. It's a very like uncomfortable watch, but like you feel for it. I think it works so well because Kaylee Spaney and Jacob Elordi both do great jobs as the lead two performances. This movie does not work nearly as well as it does without those two doing such a good job. I think also this just does a good job delivering the themes that Sofia Coppola has been doing her entire career, which is just making stories about female youth, taking stories about the female innocence and being able to amplify those and delve into how this like affects lives and how just the real world can just destroy like females at like a young age. I think this works so well with that. Theater Camp. This is the first movie in this list that I don't think the average person might have immediately heard of. Maybe Priscilla, but definitely more people probably haven't heard of Theater Camp, which you should. It's really good. But I'm going to just slightly explain what this movie is to those who don't know. Theater Camp, it's about just like a low budget, scrappy, like summer theater camp program that's like they lose their owner because they're in a coma after something. So they're like inexperienced, young, like sort of crypto bro son is trying to run things, and it takes this like documentary approach to just like following the theater camp over the summer and how he's trying to like fix it and raise money because they're really low on funds and they're trying to get money, while there's a bunch of other characters doing things. The teachers have their own struggles. There's a teacher who was just hired and doesn't know anything, and they're just kind of winging it. All the kids are kind of having their own little adventures. It's a very simple premise, just an ensemble comedy, and frankly, I can like a really good comedy. When it works really well, when the comedy is this consistently funny, it really works, and this movie does really work. There's a lot of laughs to be had. Maybe a bit, like, it's very reliant on, just like text on screen humor. There's a lot of that. There's just like, oh, it'll have some text on screen to make a joke, and sometimes it can get a bit repetitive, but I really like that style of humor, and it works well for the movie, especially with the end. I think there's still a lot of heart. There's a lot of love for like theater as a medium, just like the young, scrappy startup, just like theater, no matter what the production, just like being able to sing and it comes together, creates like the sort of found family thing. I think it has that love for it, clearly. But there's so much genuine comedy. It's just so funny. I love Jimmy Tatro, my goat, my boy. He was in American Vandal, and I like seeing him in more things, and he's like the main guy. Troy in this, he does a great job. There's so many great performances. There's great moments. This is definitely one of the biggest hidden gems, I think, of this year. Absolutely top-tier comedy, and if you haven't seen it, it's on Hulu. You should definitely check it out. John Wick Chapter 4. These John Wick movies, they always seem to like one-up themselves and get better with the action with each recursive thing, so it feels crazy to seem like, how are they going to do better than the last one? The last one was so crazy. And this one, again, it manages to do better on the action, and it's so good, and it's so well made. There's so many interesting things they do, and it keeps inventing itself like within its own movie. Like the beginning, it takes place in Japan, and it's just sort of all right, and then there's like a new action scene. It manages to excite the audience and do a new thing one after another after another. There's a scene with a bar that's like all with water, and that's really well done. And then there's a whole like 40-minute sequence in Paris where he keeps going to different things in Paris, and it feels like Hotline Miami. And there's the thing with the stairs. There's so many good action sequences in this movie. It's worth watching based off of the action alone, and frankly, that's the reason that one person would watch this. There's not really any other reason to watch this aside from the action, because frankly, the story's at the worst of the franchise. The story is not good in this. It's kind of bad, but the action is the best that it's been at the franchise. So it's this weird crossroad of just ignore most other things that aren't the actual story. The performances are good. I think the performances, like Keanu and Winston, the person who plays Winston, and Lawrence Fishburne and Alexander Skarsgård and Donnie Yen, I think they all do great performances. I think the actual story and the meat of what's happening is just sort of whatever, but when the action's so good, the action's amazing. It feels like it feels like they've been building up to this for like, I guess, a decade now with John Wick 1. It feels like they've been building up to just like, oh, this is what we're gonna do with action. They're like pulling out all the stops, and like this is how they're finishing it. This is the big action, how they want to end it all. And I think it does a really good job because of that. It feels like how they actually can't follow up on this. It feels like the perfect way to end this type of story with all the action. It feels like they've done everything they could do with John Wick as a character at this point, and I think it just works so well as a finale. It's so well made. The action is top notch. Probably some of the best action this year, frankly. It's that good. Past Lives, a big award movie this year, but one that probably the average person might not have seen or heard of, and they're probably going to hear about it for the first time when it got nominated for Best Picture. I'm recording this before nominations came out, but this is going to get nominated for Best Picture. Story of this movie is two Korean people, Nora and Hae-sung. They were childhood friends in Korea, but Nora and her family are leaving to America, and they sort of fall out of each other's lives. They sort of connect a little bit, like 10 years, like 5-10 years later, online. They try and have like a online relationship, but it doesn't really work that well. And then even much later, now that they're like adults, they actually meet up again in person, and it's like all these sort of feelings come back, and they're like, oh, what could have been? But they've each like lived their own lives, sort of thinking or not thinking about each other, but it feels like they could have like been connected, and there's a life where they could have lived together, and it's sort of like dealing with these emotions. This type of movie, it seems kind of basic, like your average rom-com minus the com, just a romantic drama. It feels a little basic, but where this movie just really excels is it's just the absolute best execution for this type of story. It does everything that it needs to do to make you feel emotions, to make you reflect on your own life. It does everything that it needs to do to make this type of romantic story work so well. And part of that is the trio of performances, both from Nora, played by Greta Lee, Hae-sung, played by T.O.U., and the new husband of Nora that she had, played by John Majaro, Arthur. I think they all do a great job, and it's so well made because it's not just, oh, these two that used to be childhood friends, and it's about their connection, but it's also about the connection with Nora and her husband Arthur, and it's about the connection of Arthur and Hae-sung, who sort of like meet, and it feels like, oh, it seems like they might have like a conflict of interest because they both sort of like her, but they really do like each other, and it feels so much more human and grounded, and it feels so refreshing to have a movie that like takes honesty and is able to conjure up emotions from just the realism of it, as opposed to like superficialating and just amping it up to a point where it feels unrealistic and it feels like you're pandering to an audience. Just being able to feel grounded and show what's real makes this movie work so well. And if you like these types of romance movies, you should watch this 100%. Even if it is mostly spoken in Korean, you're gonna get something out of it by the end of the day. Very heartfelt, very emotionally moving movie. Definitely worth your time. Nimona. This was a Netflix animated movie that was originally going to be released by Disney under the Blue Sky banner. It was going to be the last movie released by Blue Sky after they were sort of on the up and up with Spies in Disguise. But as Disney shut down Blue Sky, this movie got shut down with it, which was a shame because it had a lot of gay themes based off the original novel, and it felt like a very nice next step, and it felt like Blue Sky was really heading in the right direction. So it was a shame that this movie got canned, but Netflix picked it up, and there was worry that like, oh, picking it up, it might like lose some of what the original animated movie was going to have, but that was not the case, because this feels like it almost doubles down on the queer themes of the original graphic novel that it's based on, and I feel like that works wonders for this movie. I feel like it does a really good job just amplifying these themes and being able to tell them in like a child-friendly but still effective way that you can reflect and see yourself into like any one of these characters. It works so well. A little simplistic with the story, but again, sort of like with Spider-Verse, you're seeing this for the animation, you're seeing this for like characters, and this does such an amazing job. The animation is top notch here. There's so much creativity, there's so much life in this world, there's so much to enjoy with the animation style. It goes hand in hand with the characters and how they work off of one another. It goes hand in hand with the story as a whole. The animation is top notch here, some of the best animation this year. I think the VO work is also really well done. Chloe Grace Moretz as Nimona does a great job. Riz Ahmed does a really great job. Eugene from the Try Guys does a good job. It's crazy that he's in this movie, but he does a good job as well. I think this movie, just in general, does a really good job capitalizing on just an itch that feels like animated movies should have been doing for such a long time, but it feels like it understands what makes an animated story like this work so well, and it's able to just fully deliver and capitalize on it. It's a little like cheesy here and there, and it's a little predictable with how it does things, but it works in the moment, and I think it's definitely worth the time for any. This year was a good year for animation as a whole. This is one that I think is overlooked by a lot of other animated movies this year, but it is one of the best of this year, and it should be on anyone's radar who likes animation. This should be on your radar if you haven't seen it already. The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar. This one's kind of cheating because it's technically a short film. It's one of the 4 short films that Wes Anderson made for Netflix, based off Roald Dahl films. This is the longest of them. It's like 40 minutes long, but frankly, it's so good that I'm counting it. And it's 40 minutes, so it's not like a super short film. And I even liked it more than Wes Anderson's actual theatrical debut this year. Did not debut. His other theatrical movie this year, Asteroid City. This whole short is just filled with Anderson's signature style combined with like the writing and style of Roald Dahl. It's a match made in heaven, and the two complement each other perfectly. I think the story as a whole is the strongest of the 4 shorts. There's a lot to it. It goes a lot of different angles. It feels like 3 different stories in one, and I think it works really well with Wes Anderson's style to tell that type of story. I like seeing actors that haven't been in Wes Anderson movies before, like Dev Patel and Benedict Cumberbatch, because they lend themselves really well to Wes Anderson's style of filmmaking, and it feels like a match made in heaven that they're actually in these types of movies, because it feels like, oh, they should just be doing these movies. They should be a part of the regular Wes Anderson cast and be in all his movies going forward. It's definitely the most complete of all the shorts. It's got a lot of thematic resonance. It has a lot of powerful themes, and there's a lot of good emotional moments that lead into it. It's hard to really talk about it without spoiling certain things, but it's only 40 minutes and it's on Netflix. It's definitely worth checking out, even if you initially ignored it because, oh, it's like a short film, or if you haven't seen Anderson's other work, you were more interested in Asteroid City. This one's definitely worth a watch. Rye Lane. This movie is a original romantic comedy from Britain that follows some 20-somethings that are both dealing with a bad breakup, but end up meeting each other and bonding over their mutual like rough relationships that they both went through, and they're able to like help each other go through it, and then they end up falling in love with each other. It's a very simple premise. It's told with such passion and frantic energy that you can't help as an audience but feel wrapped up in their story and get involved and feel the emotion that they're feeling. It's wild that this movie works just so well because it's from a debut director who hasn't directed a feature film before this. Most of the actors in it are unknown. It works really well just because it understands the core fundamentals of what makes romantic comedies work so well, and it's able to build on that in a modern setting with modern filmmaking techniques and be all stylish and be comedic with its editing and sets and all these other things, and it's allowed to build on what has already been told about romantic comedies for so many decades, but it still feels original and fresh in an exciting way that feels like the future of where the genre is actually heading. While at the same time, it still has the core tenets that make romantic comedies so good for so long. The chemistry between the two leads is top notch. They have a real connection on screen that you feel, and it adds to the comedy when they riff off of each other and go back and forth, and it adds to the actual charm of the film and the actual like passion and romance at the center of it. Romantic comedies kind of fall into the same rut a lot of the time, but especially if you still like the genre and looking for more inventive takes that aren't just like the same tired stories told over and over, this is definitely one to check out because it definitely flew under my radar, but it really is really good. You got to check it out. All right, Barbie. So it's no surprise, Barbie is the biggest movie in the year. Like, everyone else has seen it. Everyone and their grandma has seen it. It's made a bunch of money because it's because it like tapped into something and created a type of film that just is so rarely seen, and it actually fully delivered on its wild and zany premise. It seems like in the hands of anyone else other than Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach, it just wouldn't work. But because those two are behind the helms writing and directing, it works so well. It just like fundamentally understands like the inherent comedy of Barbie and just like making a Barbie movie, so it leans into the nonsense of just like making a Barbie movie, and it just goes off the walls and goes crazy in the best possible way. The set designs are insane, especially in the first act where everything in Barbie Land looks plastic. It's so well done. All the costumes look great. I think there's so much to love about Barbie. There's so much like love and passion put into the movie. You can tell it's a movie that just so much fun was being made. I mean, what else can I say that hasn't already been said about the movie? I feel like just everyone has seen it and understands why it works so well. And I feel like its messages work really well. I feel like it has a great like message about just like empowerment. And I mean, like, it's a little basic, and it's still got sort of the hang-ups of being a corporate, like, tied Barbie movie. But I think for what it is, it's absolutely the best that it could possibly be for the type of movie that it is. And I'm more excited for whatever Greta Gerwig has planned next, because she's proved herself to be a very capable director. and she just kind of doesn't miss, especially after Lady Bird and Little Women, which were both also great in this. She's just proven herself to be one of the like premier female directors of our era right now, so I'm excited to see what she does next. Oppenheimer. This is another movie that was really successful this year, kind of the defining dramatic movie this year. Most everyone has seen it. It made almost $1 billion, which for being a 3-hour-long historical drama is crazy that it made that much money. But there's a reason that it made this much money. It's because it's 3 hours long, but it has just perfect pacing. You don't feel the runtime at all while you're watching it. It feels emphatic and powerful from the first second to the very last second. You feel involved. There's so much going on, and you feel like it works so well. Nolan's always good at this. I think people gravitate towards Nolan's more action-oriented movies as being his best. Movies like Interstellar, Dark Knight, Inception. But I feel like Nolan has always been his best in a more dramatic role to allow his writing to really shine more first. I think Memento and The Prestige do a good job at that. And I think this is also up there with that. It allows him to just focus more on the writing and his directorial style to really shine through as opposed to just the action. I think all the performances are really good, not just Cillian Murphy as the maid, but there's so many actors in this movie. Then even the ones who show up for just like one scene, like Roderick, fucking Devin Boston, he like makes an impact in the one scene that he's in. There's just so many moments like that, which is crazy to keep that consistency up for a 3-hour movie, to just feel like something is happening at every moment and you could feel involved and feel excited. Visuals are amazing. The visuals are top notch. That's come to expect from Nolan. That was like the big draw of the movie, is that the visuals are amazing, but they just kind of are. And the music is easily some of the best of the score this year. It's top notch stuff. And I'm just kind of singing the same praises that everyone else has said about Oppenheimer, but it's kind of just like that, you know. It's one of the biggest movies of the year for a reason, and it's probably going to win Best Picture. It's Oppenheimer. It's Oppenheimer. What else do you want me to say? All right, bottoms. It's always a little strange to put such a like weird sort of absurdist comedy this high on my list above like hard-hitting dramas like Oppenheimer and Past Lives, but my tastes for humor are weird, just like everyone else's. I grew up on the internet age, and this just kind of hits that perfect itch of just in-your-face nonsense absurdist with a like harsh, cynical, satirical edge that just hits exactly where it needs to for me, and it's so funny. It just fits exactly with my tendencies for humor, the left-leaning, like satirical, just in-your-face style. I love it. I think Rachel Sennett and Ayo Edebiri are both amazing as a lead duo. They work off each other greatly comedically, and they have a lot of great moments. There's a lot of riffing. I think they do well, extremely. I think the movies just has so many jokes, just keep running. There's like, it's firing 100 jokes a minute, and at least one of them is going to make you really laugh. I think each person has their own like favorite joke with this type of movie. There's always like a couple that you can think back to and laugh at. I think just the whole thing surrounding the bully character, I laugh every time, where he's just like a complete moron, and I think his best friend, where he's like hopelessly trying to live up to him. There's so much like, even outside of the main trio where there's clear like gay queer energy with like the Fight Club and there's gay romances, I think there's so much like clear homoerotic energy from the bullies, and it just kind of all weaves together, and it becomes this like very silly tongue-in-cheek style that is not for everyone, but it's for me, and I really enjoy this style of in-your-face satirical gay humor. Even just as a parody, it has a lot to say about teen movies and sort of the like cliches and tropes of them, but instead of just like being like repeating the same jokes and lambasting like, oh, like, isn't it weird that teen movies do this, that a lot of other like teen parodies do, it feels more like it understands what makes teen movies work. It understands the premise and the settings of teen movies and what is like so exciting and enthralling about them, and is able to add on its own like new additions in the modern era while like reflecting on what has made teen movies of the 80s and 90s work so well, and makes for this interesting divide like visually. And I think it works very well for this tone of being a parody satire. I think Letterboxd as a whole maybe overrates this a bit. I'm putting it in my top 10, so I'm overrating it as well. But I don't really care. This was definitely one of my favorite comedies of the year. And if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. All right. The Boy and the Herons, the latest movie from Studio Ghibli, and the return of director Hayao Miyazaki, who had since retired, but he came back to direct this movie. He's kind of like the uncontested greatest of all time when it comes to animation in the 21st century. He has so many masterful movies under his belt: Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke. There's just so many classics, so it's interesting to see him return 10 years after his last movie with like modern tendencies and the reflection of his legacy that he taps on a lot in this movie. The Boy and the Heron is definitely just the swan song, and even if it isn't his final movie, it feels like the final chapter of his career. It has a lot of reflection of himself, of his previous works. There's a lot of callbacks to his stylings and things that work in his previous movies, but it's also just this self-contained understanding of like, oh, like my life is ending soon, but like he's sort of, there's so much that this movie taps on, and it's hard to just necessarily describe because it's so like metaphysical and reflective on oneself, but it works so well in the context of this movie with the like 1940s post-war, like right in the mid-war post-war Japan, and the reflection and like dealing with that and dealing with loss and dealing with like familial bonds. There's a lot going on in this, as it is with Miyazaki's other movies. They're just like loaded with these powerful themes that work so well thanks to just the visuals, because the visuals are top notch in this movie. It's been a case for Miyazaki's movie. Spirited Away has amazing visuals. Princess Mononoke has amazing visuals. The Boy and the Heron shows that 2D animation still has a place in modern cinema because it looks amazing. It looks beautiful. There's jaw-dropping sequence after jaw-dropping sequence, and the characters have such like fresh and unique designs. The world building is so powerful. There's a lot to like here, especially if you're a fan of other Ghibli movies and other Miyazaki movies, especially after Ghibli's last movie, the Earwig and the Witch, was such like a disappointment. It went to 3D. This is such a breath of fresh air, and it shows that Miyazaki still has what it takes to be like one of the top dogs in animation. Poor Things. This is the latest movie from Yorgos Lanthimos, who directed The Lobster, The Favorite, Killing of a Sacred Deer. So he has a tendency to make like weird and strange concepts and being able to deliver on that in an affecting and heartfelt way. Poor Things is easily the most that it does. This movie is balls to the walls crazy for nearly every second of its runtime. The visuals are insane. There's so many colors and bright colors in the crazy sets. The story is strange and unorthodox. It follows the story of like a scientist who brings a dead woman back to life, but she's the actual dead woman is still dead, but she was pregnant. So he takes the unborn baby and puts the undeveloped mind in the body of the adult human woman. So it's just an adult progressing, but it's still a child. And then they're just off and they go explore the world as like with the appearance and as an adult, but still like learning and doesn't know the world and evolve and growing as a person. And it's very weird and it gets uncomfortable because that's kind of the way the story lends itself to be. It goes to some darker and more gross places, but it has this like aura of comedy and nonsense, and with all the visuals you can't help but like laugh at all the absurdity of it all. It works well. It's a type of story that could very easily not work well and can feel like gross and uncomfortable, but it does it in just the right way that makes the story really work. It has the nice heartfelt moments that make it work, and it's able to just work well through this artistic core. I think the score is very interesting for a movie this style. It's very weird and off-putting score. It's very different from a standard movie score. It's does with bleeps and bloops and a lot of different things. It's an interesting score if you want to listen to it on its own. It adds to the entire experience, and I think it's one of the highlights of the movie. The editing as a whole, just the cinematography, everything works together for this movie to make a strange, unusual experience. Even if some of the characters act like normal people, nothing feels normal about this movie, and I think that's one of its biggest strengths. It's so afflicted because the themes and the core of this movie is about just the wonders of life, just like how the wonders and the terrors of life, I should say. It's just how day-to-day life goes on, like the negatives that come from that, but also just the beauty of living and the beauty of understanding life and all of its glory. And I think this film does a great job of explaining that, and does with its execution. It's so interesting. I think the performances also do a great job of this. Emma Stone does a great lead performance. It's very easy to mess up a performance like hers, where she's like a child but in a human body. It seems like it could come across as like problematic, but it's done with such grace and it's done so well, and it finds a way to still be funny, even if it could be taken misconstrued and taken the wrong way. I think it works very well. Also, comedic performances from Mark Ruffalo and Willem Dafoe, I think they also do a great job. Mark Ruffalo like makes me laugh every time he's on screen. He's doing some over the top nonsense, but it works in the confines of this movie because like everything feels over the top and in your face, so it just works. It came out at the end of this year, so not too many people have like seen it, and I don't know if it's even on streaming yet, but you should definitely check it out when you get the chance if you love wild and strange movies that aren't afraid to show a little bit of gore, a little bit of nudity, a bunch of nonsense. It's great. You should definitely check it out. Killers of the Flower Moon. Martin Scorsese is a legendary filmmaker. He has such a powerful namesake in itself, where everything it feels like he touches has is like, oh, it's super amazing on tours. So it feels a little cheesy and cheeky for me of a fucking like critic to be like, oh yeah, Scorsese's latest movie, of course it's top 5 of the year. But it really is that good. It's crazy that he's able to rebuild and reflect upon his past and what he's made in previous films, and is able to build upon and create something for the present while being able to like understand the movies of his past, how they were received, and can create a story for now with today's audiences in mind. And it's so well made. So few filmmakers have the understanding and just full control of their craft to be able to make a 3.5 hour movie feel like it goes by in less than 1 hour. It goes by so fast. You're constantly like amped up in the moment. It constantly keeps you engaged. There's so many great moments. You're so few, especially for a movie with that long of a runtime. It's such an impressive feat, which goes both to Martin Scorsese and, of course, editor Thelma Schoonmaker, who's insane. Everything about this movie looks beautiful. Everything about how it's put together works so well. There's so many great performances here, whether they're big leading performances like Leonardo DiCaprio or Lily Gladstone, supporting performances like Robert De Niro, or even just people who show up for like one scene will make an impact. There's so many just like little characters here, especially that kind of comes with the territory of a 3.5 hour movie, but there's so many characters that show up for like a couple scenes, but they immediately leave an impact on the audience, and you know them, you feel everything. There's so much going on in Killers of the Flower Moon where it seems like it would be overwhelming, but it isn't. It leads you in, and it has such a powerful statement to make. Easily one of the best endings in a movie this year. It's so wild, it's so strange for a movie like this to have this ending, and it's the ending that you just constantly think about like months after it happens, because it's so unlike any movie of this style to have an ending like this, and it shows that Scorsese still like understands and is able to evolve film to this point. I think easily this is one of the best movies of the year. I think it's harder to, so many people know it's one of the best movies of the year, and it had its great theatrical run, but it's a Apple TV Plus exclusive, so it's hard to really like recommend it on top of its runtime. But it really is worth seeking out. It's absolutely one of the best of the year. Anatomy of a Fall. This is a French courtroom thriller drama that follows the mystery surrounding a man's death. A man falls from his attic, hits his head on the shed on the way down, and dies. But after it seems like he had a inflicted wound that was inflicted before he actually hit the ground, it brings everything into question as to whether maybe his wife murdered him or if he actually killed himself. And the only witness to the crime was their blind son. So it creates this whole crazy back and forth that is kind of dividing the relationship between the mother and this son, as if it wasn't already destroyed enough from the father dying. What makes this movie work so well is that it completely takes a step back and it redefines what works about the courtroom thriller and the courtroom genre, and is able to reshift the focus to make it compelling still as a courtroom drama, but tell its own powerful story with its own different focus on what makes those types of movies so well. I think normally the focus on those is just, the mystery and revealing more to the audience as it goes on. And while this definitely has that, and it has reveals and twists about the mystery itself, the focus is much less on the actual truth and like figuring out in the finality what actually happened, and it's much more on just how these moments from the past are taken to the present as seemingly innocuous moments that seemed like they wouldn't have had anything to do with murder, of course, but they can be misconstrued and taken into the modern context. And just one moment from the past, they have to define an entire person by just one moment, and it pains and it does a lot, and it hurts to be defined by one moment in your life. There's so many amazing performances here throughout the entire film. I think Sandra Hüller, in the lead actor, she does an amazing job. I think the main child actor for the blind son, he does an amazing job. Even there's a dog in the movie, and the dog does an amazing performance. Across the board, easily some of the best performances of the year are in this film. I know that many people don't watch too many like foreign movies, and having French subtitles may be more difficult to recommend this movie, but it's definitely worth time to watch this. It's one of the most compelling courtroom dramas in a long time, and I think its ending is powerful and poignant, and it's self-reflective. I like that it doesn't just outright say whether or not she murdered him, or it's very up in the air throughout the entire runtime, and even at the end, and it leaves the audience to come to their own conclusion as to what actually happened, which I think for a courtroom drama and for a mystery, it feels very powerful and makes a lot of sense. And it's crazy that more movies don't do this style of story approach for their main mystery. How to Blow Up a Pipeline. This movie is a eco-thriller. It follows a group of young people that are rising up against corporations who are not doing anything to stop climate change. They just keep on doing oil and bad things. So they come up with a plan. They come up with a heist, as it may be, to blow up a pipeline. Comical title alone. This works really well. This is almost like, it's got a lot of Ocean's 11 vibes, where you just take a large group of interesting and varied characters, each with their own little backstories and quirks, and just bring them together to perform this super tight-knit, intense heist where the stakes are high and it's on a time crunch and there's so many things that can go wrong, and there's each plans, and it works so well in the moment. It's relatively simple with its story. It's just, hey, it's these groups of people and they're blowing up a pipeline, but it's the execution that makes this just so well done. It's one of the most, easily one of my favorites, but it's one of the least I have to say because it's so simplistic in its approach, but it's just done perfectly. The Holdovers. It's a simple comedy about a grouchy old instructor at a prep school who has to care for a group of students who are left behind over the holidays on campus. Played by Paul Giamatti. He does a great job. This film exudes just a pure 70s energy that harkens back to just old school filmmaking, but it also uses the stylistic choices and thought process of modern filmmaking, able to make this perfect blending of the two worlds that works so well as a feature film. I think the performances here are some of the best of the year, easily. Paul Giamatti does an amazing job in the lead. Divine Joy Randolph, easily great, one of the best performances here. Dominic Sessa, it's his first ever performance, and he knocks it out of the park. He's amazing. I think this movie has a lot of inherent comedy, but there's also a lot of heartfelt moments. You feel a lot for each of the characters. There's a lot going on, and you feel for this connection that they sort of bond. They start hating each other, but you really feel that they bond for each other, and it feels great. There's a lot of iconic moments. There's a lot of funny moments. I think it's easy for, as a critic, to just enjoy this artsy, super intoxicating. This is a film that I easily feel like I could recommend to anyone. This is the number one, just I would recommend any person watch this movie. I feel like anyone can get something out of it, find some enjoyment. Even my number one is a movie that's more cynical and crotchety, but this movie is so heartwarming and simple and hilarious. I feel like any single person can find enjoyment in this movie. I can't imagine someone not coming out the other side being annoyed by this movie. It's that my favorite movie of 2023 is Blackberry, the biopic that tells the story about the rise and fall of BlackBerry phones from director Matt Johnson, best known for Nirvana the Band, The Show, The Dirties, and Operation Avalanche. A lot of corporate biopics came out in 2023. It was a weird trend that just kind of happened for some reason. We had Air, we had Tetris, we had the Flaming Hot Cheetos movie, we had Pinball, the man who won the game, or whatever it was called, the pinball movie. There was going to be a Pop-Tart movie this year. I don't know what happened to it. Anyways, point being, Blackberry stands out from the others because all of those sort of have this weird underlying thing of being a corporate product movie. They're like kind of commercials. Like the Air movie, despite being a good movie made by Ben Affleck, who's a great director, is a commercial for Air Jordans, and Nike. The Flaming Hot movie is just a blanket commercial for Flamin' Hot Cheetos. BlackBerry is not a commercial for BlackBerry phones. It's not afraid to show that they fucked up, and the sort of crazy people that ran this company got it to the heights that it was at like 50% market share of phones, and then brought it all the way down to zero. It's a crazy, wild story that deserved to be told on the big screen. And I think Matt Johnson doesn't seem like the kind of director that would go for a biopic like this. He works perfectly for this story. His style of comedy blends so well with just the zany chaos of these characters, and it works so well. He adds his own flair into it. He adds his own themes and messaging onto this story. He feels like the perfect fit for a director for this, and I'm excited to see what he does next because it shows that he has such a knowledge of film and how to adapt his own style into any type of film. I think there's a lot to enjoy in this movie. I think some of the performances are really good. Glenn Howerton, especially, amazing performance, top 10 performance of the year, probably top 10 performance of the decade for me. I'm overstating it, but he's Dennis and It's Always Sunny, Glenn Howerton. But you barely even recognize him. He has a bald cap in this. He exudes just a ferocious, wild energy every time he's in this movie. You can't undervalue someone who can yell fuck really well on screen, and he can do that, and he just commands screen presence whenever he's on screen, and it's amazing. I think just in general, great movie. I think especially if you were not a fan of the more commercial, like cutesy themes of like Air and Flaming Hot being more in your face, like, all right, whatever, I feel like I'm being sold something. This is much more cynical in being a corporate biopic approach, and I think it works a lot better because of that. It makes the comedy a lot better. It makes the drama a lot better. It just feels more like an actual story, and it has a powerful message. Easily my favorite of the year. I can feel myself falling in love with it more and more on rewatches. It's one of the best of the year. Probably going to be one of my favorites of the decade, if not of all time for me. This is an all-timer. Those were the best films of the year, but films can only be considered to be so great when you have such garbage to compare them to. And there were a lot of garbage films this year as well. So here are some of my worst movies of 2023. And some honorable mentions for the worst of the year. I didn't want to include some of these like cheap, exploitative Netflix documentaries because they keep pumping these out, and the bottom list would kind of be filled with them if I didn't include them. But I did want to give a special shout out to the hatchet-wielding hitchhiker, the one that talked about Kai on the Internet Story, and the Pornhub documentary that they did. Both of those were just very cheaply made, kind of exploitative, didn't delve well enough into it like a real documentarian should, or how a real documentary should do. And then aside from that, just some other, I don't want to go too deep into these movies because they are, good enough that I would still maybe not good enough that I would recommend them, but they have their qualities that I wouldn't immediately put them on the worst. But I did say other rough things from this year. I would throw Five Nights at Freddy's, not great fun, but not good. Trolls 3, again, has some moments, but not good. Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, had potential, still fell under expectations. Good Burger 2, better than I thought it was going to be, but still obvious cash grab legacy sequel. And Kids vs. Aliens, which I think had potential and should have potential, had fun moments, but had a really bad ending and just kind of failed to stick the landing for me. Also, Our Drawings by Kalobi probably deserves a spot on the bottom 2023 list, but I didn't feel comfortable putting a literal YouTuber movie on the list, as funny and bad as it is. You should definitely watch it. It's on YouTube, but I felt uncomfortable, especially because other people are talking about it now, and I didn't want to put it on the list. It didn't fit with the vibe. Wish is the latest animated movie from Walt Disney Animation Pictures, not to be confused with their like other subsidiaries like Pixar and other studios. This is the latest official Disney movie, and they've kind of been on a weird, shaky ground. When they get too comfortable with popular things, like they have been with like Frozen and Moana, they fall into this rut of doing the same types of things over and over. And Wish is probably like the most generic and laziest that they've gotten in a while. Worse than even Strange World. Not as bad as Wreck-It Ralph 2, but it's still really bad, and it's derivative of all just the generic trends of Disney during this decade so far. The music is some of the worst that we've had for a straight-up Disney musical for a while, especially compared to something like Encanto, where the music is helmed by someone who did musicals like Lin-Manuel Miranda. Wish, its music feels very pop-songy. It doesn't fit with the tone of a musical, and it feels designed to get ratings than it is to actually work as a cohesive musical. I think the visuals, it tries to follow in the footsteps of stylized movies like Spider-Verse and The Bad Guys, but it doesn't understand why those were so exciting and enthralled by audiences, so it just sort of slaps an Instagram filter over what they were doing before and hopes that that's enough goodwill to work in the eyes of the audience, but it really doesn't. It just doesn't work, and it looks bad. There's so many stupid little generic things in this movie that might have worked like 10 years ago, but we've grown sick of. Like, we've grown sick of the comedic talking animal by Alan Tudyk, the goat. He has like nothing to do in the movie. These stupid like side characters that do nothing aside from have like, hey, we have a disabled character, we have a character who's this or gay, but they don't do anything and they don't have anything to say. They're just there as a check mark to be like, hey, look, check out our movie, it's got this, as opposed to actually doing something smart or interesting with their story. There's a bunch of references in this movie to like Disney's history, because it's like, oh, this is like the 100-year celebration of Disney movies, but they're all lazy and it's cheap, and it comes across as just sick and pandering. There's a lot better that Disney has done, and there's a lot of ways that they can improve and evolve with how animation is going, but this movie just feels like they're just stuck in the past, and they need to change if they want to actually do better. House Party is a 2023 remake of a classic comedy movie from the 90s that had teens doing a house party while parents were out of town. And it's like, oh, we're going to have a house party, and it's going to be a lot of fun. This is not that. It's this weird sort of adult thing where there's some house cleaners, and they end up cleaning LeBron James's house, and they're like, oh, this would be a great place for a party. So removing the teen angle really just removes a lot of the charm and coming of age stuff that the original movie had, which was part of what made that movie loved by so many people, was its effective coming of age things and its character dynamics. This just feels like an excuse to be a networking party for everyone involved, to be able to meet like celebrities. Like, hey, look, it's Kid Cudi. Here, look, it's DJ Khaled. Hey, look, it's LeBron James. It doesn't really feel like it has a lot to say aside from look at celebrity on screen and just boring, lazy comedy that hasn't been funny for like 10 years. This is the definitive movie that came out in January that you immediately forget about, and frankly, it is extremely forgettable. There is barely anything in this movie that's worth remembering, aside from one comedic scene where Kid Cudi takes them to the Illuminati to a gladiator ring, and that's fun, but the movie doesn't lean into that comedic side nearly as much as it should, and the result is just something that comes across as really, really tiring very quickly. Bad CGI Gator is another low-budget horror movie produced by Charles Band, who did Evil Bong, and he's doing that Barbenheimer movie. His studio as a whole just has this tendency to making a bunch of these low-budget, shock value type of horror movies where you just see a title or you see a premise and it gets you in the door with that, and then it doesn't really deliver that much in terms of its wild premise. This does have fun moments with the titular bad CGI gator. When the gator's actually on screen, it's a lot of fun. It looks goofy, it looks stupid, and it leans into how absurd it is. But too much of this movie relies and revolves around these just like cardboard frat bro type characters that just aren't fun to watch. We've seen them a million times, and it's lazy to do them in this type of thing. I get that that's kind of the point, is that we're doing basic generic characters. It is like exactly what you think it's going to be, but it's a joke that really, you get it immediately and it doesn't build upon itself in that much of a meaningful way, so it's not that fun to watch. There's potential for sure. It's not as outright terrible. It's not completely like winking to the audience at just how bad it is entirely. It's definitely not as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it's far from like an amazing satirical masterpiece that this type of thing could be, if that makes any sense. There's charm, but it just wears off too quickly for it to be really worth your time. The Little Mermaid live-action remake is a victim of one of the biggest problems that have plagued all of these Disney live-action remakes, the fact that this is so unbelievably bloated. This movie is 50 minutes longer than the original movie, but it doesn't add anything of value aside from some new songs which don't work, and it even removes other aspects of the original. So the result is just this movie that goes on for way too long. You don't feel any of it. It just is not interesting compared to the original. It takes way longer, and it's way more of a slog to actually get through. The only person in this cast that feels like they're actually trying is Halle Bailey, but everyone else is just doing the minimum that they need to do for a remake. Some of the voice roles just do not work. Daveed Diggs does not work as Sebastian. Awkwafina does not work as Scuttle. I don't like the design for Jacob Tremblay's Flounder. I think the realistic designs hurt this film a lot, and it takes away from the sort of beauty that the original had. The new songs, again, they're not good. They had Lin-Manuel on here, but you can't just add songs to a bona fide musical classic and make them work. The new songs stick out like a sore thumb, and they are not worth watching at all. Visuals, again, not good. I think they're really gross at times. Just in general, not even just with how the film looks, but the film doesn't have a cohesive understanding of what makes the songs work. It doesn't give enough effect with the lines that are being said at the time. It just feels like, hey, we're going to throw some realistic things on screen and that'll work. It's not as, like, egregiously terrible as other Disney live-action movies. It's not as terrible as Lion King. It's not as terrible as the Pinocchio. But this is just as soulless. It's very blatantly corporate, and there's no reason that anyone would want to watch this over the original unless they are a child. You People is a extremely forgettable Netflix comedy from the beginning of 2023 about Jonah Hill and a relationship that he's in, but he has to deal with the struggles of her dad being Eddie Murphy and their struggle relationship between his Jewish family and their Muslim family. It tries to tackle a lot of these more difficult and nuanced race relations and connecting mixed race couple messages, but it combines that with the raunchy type of style of humor of a Jonah Hill comedy, and this combination is just gross and unsettling and weird, and it does not work. Eddie Murphy in general is just kind of wasted in this movie. This is well below his pay grade for what is possible for him comedically, and the fact that he's not a writer on this movie I think really hurts, because if he was in the writing room and was able to write his character and add more to this, it just doesn't work. You have Jonah Hill in the writing room, and you have the writer of just a bunch of other not great comedies, and it just does not work. I think that also a big issue dealing with this movie is that it's over 2 hours long. It's almost 2 hours long. It's like 117 minutes. But especially for a romantic comedy of this, that is way too long, and you really feel its length. It gets bloated, and it just keeps going on forever and ever, to the point where you just want it to end, and just the comedy isn't funny. It just doesn't work. Your Place or Mine is another Netflix romantic comedy from this year, but while so many romantic comedies in this era have been experimental and evolving and taking the genre as a whole to new heights and with enough relatability to the audience and is able to connect to them more on a deeper level, something like Rye Lane was one of my favorites of this year. Your Place or Mine just goes back to the standards. It goes back to what has worked in the 90s. It goes back to a classic sort of premise, but it only does that. That's about the only thing that it's trying to do, is just, hey, we're doing a thing from the 90s and 2000s. We got Reese Witherspoon back and Ashton Kutcher. And you can't just do what has been done 100 times before and hope that it's going to work again. This movie doesn't really have any heart. It doesn't really have any soul. Everyone's just sleepwalking through this, going through the motions. There's nothing really special and earned about this. It just feels like a reunion tour through memory lane to people remembering the good old days, as opposed to doing something exciting and new. I don't really believe that Witherspoon and Kutcher have any chemistry in this. It feels like they are just doing what they've done 100 times before and much better romantic comedies in this. And the fact that they can't really connect on screen here makes the entire package just crumble underneath the weight of itself. Because if you can't believe in the true romance happening at the center of it, then what is the point of even watching a romantic comedy? Steve Zahn is also in this, and he's fun for like the 3 minutes that he has screen time. The movie could have used more as him as like a love triangle thing, but it doesn't, and it's just a basic. It's not fun. About My Father is a comedy with Sebastian Maniscalco where Robert De Niro plays his father, and he has to meet him to his in-laws' family, and they're sort of meeting, and it's like, oh, it's quirky. He doesn't connect with them because he's old and Italian. Isn't that crazy? But we've seen De Niro especially play the quirky old guy in comedies so many times over the years that you need to do something more to actually make your movie worthwhile. I think Maniscalco as a comic in general works when he's actually on stage and he's doing his set. I think the intro of this movie works well when he's talking about his heritage, and it works as a setup for just comedic back and forth and talking about funny things. But for so much of this movie, he's just focused on doing the same old, oh, family is important shtick. And this movie gets so bogged down by the same message that we've heard in 100,000 comedies at this point that you could hear from any other voice. And this movie does not do anything special to make that message any better going down. We've seen it just so many times. This is Meet the Parents at home, and there's no reason to check this out unless you're slightly interested in Sebastian Maniscalco's comics. You could watch like the first 5 minutes and then turn it off after that. Knights of the Zodiac is a live-action remake of the anime Saint Seiya, an anime that I know nothing about, but unlike the more appreciated live-action remakes like the One Piece show, this is a lot more in line with Dragon Ball Evolution and The Last Airbender. It really just destroys everything about the original. It doesn't get anything. It does this generic throwing in Hollywood actors, and nobody can really act on this. It's not good. But if it's really equally comparable as the 2020s equivalent to a film like Dragon Ball Evolution and The Last Airbender, the reason why it's not so much lower is that some of the execution in this is not terrible. I like Makenyu as the lead. He did Zoro in One Piece, so he does have an understanding of how to do this type of thing and how to act in it. He's not great from an acting perspective, but he knows how to do stuff in the action choreography to make it seem well enough. When the action isn't so focused on just terrible CGI, it's actually kind of palatable. There's some interesting quirks here, but the story is terrible. The story's terrible. This movie in general just feels like a relic of a movie that would be made 15 years ago, so it's weird that it's being made now, because nobody asked for this. Nobody would want this. It's weird that a studio would even greenlight this to be released. This is the type of film that should be written off for tax purposes. I cannot believe that this is actually a movie that exists. Mafia Mama is a comedy movie. It follows Toni Collette as she lives a normal American life, but then she's just sort of overwhelmed and swept up when she inherits a literal mafia business in Italy, so she goes over there and she has to run it all, but it's a little quirky, and she brings her like suburban mom energy. She bakes scones and she wants to be nice to people. It seems like something that would be a parody, like a almost like Airplane sort of David Zucker style thing. There is potential in this as a parody, but this plays it really straight in terms of premise wise. There is comedy, and it is a comedy movie, but the comedy is more just like, isn't this quirky? It does like this. It isn't funny enough for this premise to really work. There's like some potential with the premise, but this does not have the comedic chops to really work. It's to the point where it's difficult to really understand who this is for, because those who would normally like a style like Wine Mom type of movie like this are not going to be invested in this, because the movie gets surprisingly gory at moments when she like hits someone in the eyeball and it pops out with her heel. But those that would be interested in more just like a sort of parody sort of thing of The Godfather with this type of thing, this is too basic and formulaic to really give any sort of meat to chew on. There's nothing interesting that it says about mafia or mafia stories. It is a generic romantic comedy with this sort of Italian mafia spice just sort of thrown over it. And I'm not super offended as someone who comes slightly from Italian heritage, but it's really just lazy. You could do so much more with this premise, and you can have so much more fun with it. To do just this lazy sprinkling approach just really makes it not fun. Haunted Mansion is easily Disney's most confusing and most baffling misfire of this year, making this almost $200 million blockbuster about a comedy movie from 2003 that people didn't even really like that much. So it's weird that they even rebooted it. And they released it in the middle of July, which, like, why would you make a movie that's so clearly autumn and Halloween coded in the middle of July, a week after Barbenheimer? It's like you're asking for disaster. This feels like a straight-to-streaming movie that was given a massive budget and put in theaters for no reason. It feels like an excuse for paychecks for a lot of people involved. There's no reason this needs to exist in this fashion. It is crazy that they invested so much into this. There's not really a lot of soul in this. There's attempts. There are inklings of what could be an interesting and nuanced movie here, and the relationship between death and loss and forgiveness, but it's immediately taken away because of so much product placement and so much uninterest with the aesthetic overall. They literally throw in a Baskin Robbins name drop in the middle of someone's depressing reflection about their dead wife. It's baffling and it's destructive against the entire movie. Also, just in general, with these type of late Disney type of attempts to be all like quirky and horror and tap into that sort of hot topic market, it's clearly just corporate coded from the very beginning, to the point where you need a level of authenticity for that type of movie to really make it work and connect with that audience in a way that Tim Burton's earlier works really did. And this just feels blatantly trying to sell you something, and it's trying to foster its own audience without doing the hard work or the effort to actually get something. I'm sure there was an interesting movie at the beginning of this, but this feels like so much corporate and producer meddling to make it fit well within every circle to try and reach as wide an audience as possible, which doesn't work for a horror comedy. You're not trying to reach a wide audience. You're trying to hit a specific niche audience that likes horror, which horror has worked very well and is done experimental and able to do that. So trying to make a candy-coated version of that just falls apart at the seams. Freelance. This is a action comedy movie where John Cena plays a former Marine ex-Special Forces person, but now he doesn't really have a job and he's just a freelance employee, and he's hired to be freelance as a bodyguard, so he goes overseas, but he's like, oh, he's super good and tough, and he's better than the actual support for this foreign president dictator person. He's the bodyguard for a journalist who's interviewing. The story's really stupid. Action comedies are all over the place. There's so many action comedy movies that are being made nowadays. Movies like Bullet Train, like every other Marvel movie. There's a whole bunch of action comedies, and a lot of them are exciting, and they add a lot to this genre. So you can't just do nothing if you squander in comedy, or if you squander in action, or do like what this film does and you squander in both. It really just comes across as a boring and tiring viewing experience to sit through. John Cena has done a lot better than this, so has Alison Brie. And the other weird thing that really bogs this down is its weird, strange political angle with this dictator. It like paints him in a good light, and it's almost like pro-military. It's very strange. It is a choice, to be sure. There's like some twists, but also they're like undone with the twists. The whole thing is weird and shoddily put together. It's not great. You can do a lot better than watching this. Invitation to a Murder. There's frankly not even a lot to say about this one because it's just so boring and uninteresting. It's extremely forgettable for a murder mystery film. I genuinely forgot most of what even happens in this movie, and I watched it like pretty recently, like a couple months ago. But like, it's such a bore, especially when we're getting interesting murder mysteries nowadays with See How They Run, the Knives Out movies, Kenneth Branagh's movies with Poirot. This is just such a nothing burger movie. It's so lazy, it's just uninteresting, characters aren't fun, like nothing interesting happens. It's just a slog to get through. 65. It seems like it would be a good movie with the concept of Adam Driver. He's a future space astronaut, but he goes back to Earth, but it's 65 million years in the past, and he fights dinosaurs. It's this type of stupid, campy thing that seems like it would be a lot of fun, but it's way too dark and it's way too serious, and it is not having nearly as much fun as this goofy concept should have. There's not nearly enough actual dinosaurs on screen, and whenever they are on screen, it's literally like you can't even see them because it's all dark and rain. And there's the same stupid family themes of like, oh, I couldn't connect with my family, I feel sad about my daughter and I'm away from her. And we've seen it 100 million times that it's not interesting. Even the action and the horror, when there is something that the movie is doing, it isn't fun to watch and it's boring. It is a crime that a movie with this fun of a hook and a premise is just so boring and uninteresting to watch. You barely find any reason to care about anything that happens. And I wanted to like this movie because it seems like fun and it's an original concept, and I like Adam Driver, but nothing about this movie works on a level that feels like it should. The Marsh King's Daughter. This thriller is just so boring. There's nothing really interesting going on. It's just Daisy Ridley going through a classic dad abusive took me away, but now he's back and it's scary and I gotta fight him. I gotta deal with it. You get like literally everything. You get a scope of everything that's going to happen in the movie from the trailer. It's extremely bloated at a little under 2 hours. The pacing is egregious and it feels like it takes eons to get through. It's the director of the first Divergent movie. It's just so cookie cutter and basic with its themes. We've seen it 100,000 times. It's so just boring and tiring. Sweetwater is a sports biopic that follows the story of the first black NBA player and the racism that he faces while trying to get there and his sort of humble beginnings. But while this could have potential in this story if it was from someone who really cared about basketball or someone who really had an understanding of Sweetwater in a story, this is from the director of the Charlie Sheen 9/11 movie, and it has no subtlety. It has no care for Sweetwater's actual story. It's just another basic white savior retelling of this story that focuses way more on the coaches and people involved in Sweetwater's life as opposed to him himself. I think it's kind of gross how it does this, even made worse by the fact that it's like 2 hours long and it has terrible pacing. It's not interesting to watch. It's the same. It feels like a parody of sports biopics to a point where it plays the same music cues, the same types of build-up. It's like, oh, you're getting a chance, rookie, playing the game, and he's messing up with the game, but then he proves that he's right. But the judges don't like how he plays because he's changing it too much. It feels literally like a parody. It's insane. It's crazy that this is a movie that came out this year. This is something that would get this is something that would be criticized for being too generic in the early 2000s, so it's crazy that this is coming out nowadays. Nobody saw this movie, but it's still just so disappointing that this can be made and someone put a pass on this. Like, yeah, this product is fine. Wild. The Retirement Plan with Nick Cage. It's an action comedy where he's an old man and his family tries to visit him and he gets caught up in a mafia sort of thing. But because he used to be good at that type of stuff, he like fights back. It's like, oh, it's cool, but he's old and he can fight back. Too bad this movie is bad because I don't know, it's a basic concept. It can work under a different guise, under a different director, under different supervision, but the action's so poorly done. The comedy that they try to do is so weird and poorly done. This movie is only designed to be watched by a 60-year-old sitting on a couch somewhere to be able to, like, I recognize Nick Cage, he can kick ass and doesn't pay attention to how this actually kind of works. It's just so boring. There's not a lot going on. The action, again, is really poorly made. There's just bad pacing. There's bad performances overall. The budget feels astronomically small. It feels like, where did the money go for this thing? It actually just feels like a money laundering scheme with how much just throwing, just to get stars on the screen, like Ernie Hudson and Ron Perlman just doing blanket performances of nothing. I'm curious how this even got made, because it actually just does feel like a money laundering scheme. Die Hard. It's difficult to even really call this a movie, because while from the surface it seems like, oh, this is just another low budget type of streaming service original Kevin Hart action comedy type thing, what those who might not know is that this was a Quibi original series of shorts, except they just spliced every single episode together, to just jammed it all together to fit into a feature-length movie, and it's just reusing that, but it's just one individual viewing, and it makes an already bad action comedy a lot worse, because there's a lot of weird, jarring pacing issues that come from jamming an entire series into one thing and acting like it's one full movie. There's weird twists and there's confusing shifts in tone constantly, and it makes an already bad product that much worse execution-wise. And this was already really rough to watch. Kevin Hart isn't a writer here, so with this story doing a satirical, it's following Kevin Hart playing himself as he wants to be an action star, and that leads to potential of being a satirical look at, action stars and how Hollywood system works. It doesn't really have anything to say, and just does Kevin Hart. He's a little funny guy. It just does the same stuff we've seen over and over again, which would be fine if this was just a standard Kevin Hart comedy, but the fact that it presents itself as this satirical lens and wants to be like a sort of critique of Hollywood or action movies or method actors, but it really has nothing to say, and the joke is just on Hart himself. It's confusing what they even wanted out of this. It's confusing what producers wanted out of this. It's just it's a rough watch that I would not recommend. All right, these last three movies, my bottom three of the year, are easily the most interchangeable. You could pretty much swap any of these last three, because they're the three that most effectively and easily pissed me off the most during this year. And this first one is a bit of a weird case, because it's one of those classic, it was part of 2022's award season, but it came out only in wider release. I was only able to see it in January when it came out, so I'm qualifying it for 2023 based off of my availability to see it. So with that in mind, The Sun was one of the most disappointing and painful viewing experiences I had last year. And it came right at the beginning of the year, so it was at the bottom of my list for pretty much the entire year until I was catching up on new releases. This is a film, it's a depiction of suicidal tendencies and depression in this young kid, but instead of actually focusing on that and doing a deep dive into how someone would get into that, the kid has like no character whatsoever aside from I'm sad. The movie actually focuses on his dad and how he just kind of painfully is unaware and can't deal with his son's depression, leading to the very obvious and dark end point of this movie, which doesn't matter how real or dark it gets, it feels like just an emotionally manipulative yank just to get tears from its audience members who aren't incredibly aware of where it's going and why it's going in that direction. It feels disgusting and emotionally manipulative, which sucks because it came from the director of one of the most intelligent and poignant dramatic films in the past couple of years, The Father. It's crazy that these are made by the same director and same writer, because like, how can you make something so perfectly balanced and understanding the weight of its material on one end, and the other completely misinformed and completely at sometimes just harmful depiction of what you're doing on the other? It's genuinely baffling, but this movie pissed me off to no end. As someone who dealt with depression during times, it hurts seeing something just take it so lightly and use it as a prop at times. It feels like it doesn't feel like it has anything to say about depression. It doesn't have anything to say to not to uplift, but it doesn't have anything to reflect upon or like how we get there. It's a movie for people dealing with friends who have depression, which feels disgusting, because that's not who needs help. You want to have something for depression, but it's easy to say that, but this really is just gross and disgusting in the moment is where this is at its worst. It's just, it leads on, because it's 2 hours long, and it leads up to this for so long, and from the first second, you know the entire movie, how it's going to play out, and you're just, like, waiting for it for 2 hours. It's like, all right, I get it. Can we move on? I understand where this is or how it's going. It just disgusted me to no end. I would not recommend anyone watch this. It genuinely pissed me off. A film that topped many other people's worst of the year lists, Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, the infamous horror movie public domain cash grab from the beginning of the year that made use of Winnie the Pooh entering the public domain and decided, hey, we're gonna make a spooky horror movie about it, which, like, in concept, isn't bad on its own. I don't want to, like, immediately dismiss, oh, it's bad because it's a horror movie and it disgraced these characters. You can do what you want with Winnie the Pooh and make it a horror movie if you want to, but at least do something creative with it. This does nothing to limit it. It does nothing interesting with this concept. It doesn't, like, oh, and it has interesting things. It's literally just two guys with a fucking Winnie the Pooh and a piglet mask, and that's, like, all it really is. It does nothing to build upon 100 Acre Wood or the interesting facets of Winnie the Pooh or the world. It doesn't have anything to say about the original story. It doesn't have anything to add. It is quite literally just a cash grab. It's something that everyone recognizes, but it's horror now. Kid thing, but evil. Isn't that spooky? Pibby. It's just painful, and it doesn't do anything interesting. On top of the fact that it's just not very well made. The lighting is terrible. There's some half-decent kills, but, like, you can get that in any other horror movie nowadays. The characters are wooden. The story is not interesting. It's like the first story you would think of if you thought Winnie the Pooh but horror movie. It's like Christopher Robin left them behind, and then they went evil. It literally feels like a sixth grader would write that plot synopsis, and then they just go on a rampage and kill people. I'm more interested, and I hope the sequel that they're making, because this made enough money because of the headlines and intrigue behind Winnie the Pooh horror movie. I hope the sequel does more interesting things, because it cannot be as bad as this one. It'll have a higher budget, so they'll be able to do more and have something more interesting. But it's not even funny bad like a lot of other cheap horror movies are. It's just a slog to get through. It's boring, and it's not fun. There's a lot of ways for a movie to become one of the worst of the year, whether it's just bad execution or a bad idea in general, or just mismanaged some other way. But really, the easiest way to just grind my gears and really annoy me is to just disgrace something that was already good to begin with, disgracing a good name, and just throwing its own modern spin that just does not work and actively removes aspects of the original that works so well. And for me, there was no clear, big example of that aside from White Men Can't Jump, the remake by Calmatic, who also did the House Party remake from earlier in this list. And this is the same thing again. It takes that classic 90s movie and it completely removes any of the charm, any of the messages, any of the themes, any of these interesting characters. It has no respect or care for what the original movie was and what it stood for. That movie had actual themes. It had an actual core message. It had memorable moments. It had memorable characters. This has Jack Harlow in place of Woody Harrelson. Like, talk about a fucking downgrade. Why is he here? What is the thought process here? He's just here to catalog and advertise for his newest music, I guess, but there's no interest or care or love for this original movie, which has aged. It's a movie from the 90s that it was a comedy and talked about race relations, but it wasn't just about that. It talked about the love for basketball and the difference between that and the sort of commercialization of the game and the actual love for the game itself. And there's hustle culture and, like, poverty, and there's so many different aspects of the original film. Well, this is just, it tries to be, like, modern, but at the same time it just batters down and waters down everything that the original stood for, and it doesn't have anything interesting. There is nothing on the level of what Rosie Perez was doing in the original White Men Can't Jump, and it is a shame that this tries to equate itself and even has the same name as the original. It feels comical to say this because it feels like such an obvious thing, but the reason that the original movie was called White Men Can't Jump had a plot point about Woody Harrelson not being able to dunk a basketball, and there's no issue for Jack Harlow here being able to dunk. That feels like the one thing that if you wanted to adapt the original movie is that you should have the reason that the title is called that play a part of your new movie, but it doesn't, and they add the whole, like, TikTok and social media trend, and there's all these comedic side characters that add nothing and are just annoying to watch. Everything about this movie was pissing me off as I watched it, because especially after rewatching the 90s one, that one works so well as a product of its time. It works well, and it still has things to say. This has nothing to say. This is just made for a streaming. It is a recognizable name for someone to watch and put on in the background. This is soulless filmmaking at its finest. This is soulless streaming filmmaking at its finest. There's nothing of value here to be gained, and there is nothing of value that could be gained from something like this. But even then, it still somehow found a way to disappoint me on deeper levels that annoy me just thinking about it. And that was my list. I hope you enjoyed, and if this was something that interested you, even if you don't agree with my opinions, let me know what your favorite movies and least favorite movies of the year were. I'm curious at least what I missed. Obviously, I couldn't talk about every single movie that I saw, but I'm sure there was something that I should check out. Whether if it was great or something that was bad. Tell me something that you really liked that I should probably check out, or something that you really didn't like that I should still check out. But if there's something more that you would want me to talk about, whether it's like a new movie review release or a different list ranking type sort of thing, I'm down to start doing more stuff with this on the channel with this new GlumboCorp Reviews rebrand. I'm excited to sort of do more with the channel as a whole. So if you guys have any ideas for stuff I should talk about in the future, let me know, and I think it'll be a lot of fun, this new sort of venture. And subscribe and like so you don't miss out on all that stuff.